One of the challenges of being our church is that we are not only growing, we are a church on the move. But we're still learning and growing together, so that's the beautiful thing. So let's read our passage together. Matthew 5:13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Amen, and may the Lord bless the reading of His Word. The title of our message today is Appetite for Faith. Go ahead, you may be seated. The title of today's message is Appetite for Faith. And I've entitled it this way because I think the challenge that we have in our Christian lives is always, in one way, said in this way at least, but it's the same central issue is always about where are we with our faith? Where are we with our faith? You know, it doesn't really matter what kind of food I can post up here. I know many of you ate, so you're probably a little more well-fed, and this is not going to bother you as much, and that's okay. So this is not a dangerous sermon, at least from a food standpoint. But you know, we know what we like in food, right? And we know what we enjoy. But one of the things I want to ask are actually two questions that are going to be the underlying questions that I want us to address today. One is, are you spiritually hungry? Are you spiritually hungry? And then the second question is this: do you also create spiritual hunger in other people's lives? Today's message, we're going to talk about salt and light. And I was trying to think of how we should cover this and why and what way should I do this. And these are the two questions that I felt just the Lord laid on my heart. Do we hunger spiritually? And do we generate hunger spiritually in other people's lives? Our passage is very straightforward. We got a number of slides. We're going to cover a bunch of ground. But I want us to point out one very important thing. This section is essentially anchored with two statements. You are. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And if you are here today and you are a Christian, one of the things that we need to begin with is not, oh, I'm trying to be a Christian. It's, you are a Christian. And Jesus comes after the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes simply to say what? This is who you are. You may not feel like it. You may not succeed at it. When you look at around in your life and your actions and your behavior. But at the end of the day, Jesus wants to start us off with this statement. This is where you are and where you're starting from. It's not like I have to work my way in. No. You are salt. You are light. And most of the sermon, actually all of the sermon, is going to be unpacking those two things, salt and light. And you've probably heard many sermons on this before. But our first section here says, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. There are three things that we should cover in this. And the first off we're going to talk about is salt. Just to ask the basic question, what kind of salt? In our modern world today, we are a little bit departed from what the ancient world in the times of Jesus understood as salt. But there's different varieties of salt that we know today. There's just plain old common table salt. There's iodized salt that we've treated. Mineral salts, which are, of course, not exactly NaCl. Perhaps magnesium chloride or potassium chloride. There's also laboratory-grade salts that are very pure, meant for laboratory experiments. And then there are specialized salts for religious purposes, like kosher salt. But But the salt that we have in mind today is actually of two varieties, because this is what would have what have been their primary means of gaining salt, because they didn't have giant chemistry labs. It's these two, the sea salt and rock salt. So these are the two main sources of salt. And this is what they would have been thinking about and conceiving about in these times, these two types of salt. Anybody know where this picture comes from? Does anybody recognize the color of the water? This is from the Mediterranean Sea. And so in Israel, you can go to the coast. You would go from Galilee, where Jesus was, teaching and saying these things, and you could move eastward. And probably the closest place you would have been to is Caesarea Maritima, as they call it in the Roman times. And you would head east, and you would head out to the Mediterranean Sea, and this is the kind of water that we would see. And it's so beautiful. In fact, they call it sort of this special color blue. It's a lapis blue. And the Mediterranean is known for this. And it's because of the kinds of salt that are in that particular water from the rocks and the minerals as they wash into that sea. Here's another picture. It's a deeper color. And we know that lapis blue is also a mineral. It's a stone. And it has this kind of color, and there's variation in it. And there's nothing like the color of the Mediterranean Sea. It's beautiful. And I point all of this out simply to say what? These are the two kinds of salts. Of course, you can have them in mines also, but we're going to come to that in a little bit later. So this is the kind of salt they were thinking about. But I want to ask this question, the second portion. It says salt of the earth. And what does this mean? You know what's really fascinating about salt? There are all different kinds of salt across this earth. I don't know if you recognize, the left salt is pretty white, but it's actually all from sea salt. But these two on the left are actually rock salt based. If you know your specialty salts, maybe you'll recognize the one on the bottom right. Right? It's pink Himalayan salt. And you know what's so cool about sea-based salt? And even mineral salt that is mined? There's a natural taste to it, that each one is unique. Himalayan salt has certain minerals and components in it that make for a very rich and soft textured flavor. Mediterranean sea salt, like color and similar to what you see on the left, those giant piles, they actually have huge salt farms. And they'll flood areas of pools of water, and they'll let that water evaporate, and what's left behind is the salt. And then they'll rake it all up together. And the variety of all the minerals, potassium, magnesium, all these other salts versions that are mixed together create the unique kind of flavor that's in that salt. And so the really good chefs don't use plain sodium chloride. They use what? Mediterranean sea salt, or California sea salt, or in this case, perhaps pink Himalayan salt. And on the upper right, we have this black salt, and that actually comes from Hawaii. Right? It's Kiwi black salt. So each area has very unique salt, and salt is all over the world. And so Jesus is speaking out of this metaphor, and he's speaking not only universally because all people use it, but also because this is not salt of the world or for the world in just a Jewish sense. This opens up now the message for the whole world. This guy here in this picture here, he's in Jakarta, and he's also working on a salt farm. And Christ's concern for salt also reaches with the gospel to the whole world. But we need to also address this concept of losing saltiness. Because I don't know if you've thought about it, sodium chloride doesn't really corrupt. If you work in a lab, you can have sodium chloride sitting there and it doesn't go bad. So you're wondering, okay, how in the world does this go bad? Well, I want to ask this question. Everybody recognize what this is? This is Da Vinci's Last Supper, right? But it doesn't look like a painting, it's a sculpture. I want to ask you, what is this made of? Can you guess? It's made out of salt. Very good. Now, if I were to ask this next question and somebody answered, I will be very, very, very impressed. Where is this sculpture? And the answer is right here. And you might say, well, where is this, Pastor Eric? Well, it's underground. It's halfway around the world. This is in Poland. And the title of this is actually the town where it's based is Wieliczka Salt Mines in Poland. And if you were to go to Poland, one of the places you could go is this particular salt mine, which is fascinating. It is up to 1,000 feet underground, the caverns that they've carved out and they've been doing mining. In fact, it's so extensive, here's a little picture of what it looks like. So if you can imagine 1,000 feet is probably about 1,000 feet wide also. All these different corners and places. And what they found is all of the salt deposits and rock salt, and they had a whole mining community. The community was so extensive, and the Christian Polish environment there, they actually built worship places underground, carved out of salt. And so everything you see here, except for maybe the cloth and some other things, pretty much everything is made out of salt, intricately carved. In fact, I want you to look at one particular thing. It's the shiniest, brightest thing in this room. It's what? The chandelier. And each of these crystals are made out of salt. It is beautiful, isn't it? And I'm thinking about all the care to craft these things. It was their life because it was surrounded by salt. But there's an interesting problem. Crystals on these chandeliers will get dull with time. In other words, the salt is slowly, so to speak, getting bad. Why? NaCl doesn't do that. But the issue is what? Purity. Purity. Because all those other minerals that are in that salt engage and interact chemically. And that's how salt goes bad. Because we're not talking about laboratory salt, we're talking rock salt and sea salt. And so it is possible, if we think back in the right context of their time, for salt to go bad. Interesting. And you know what? In much the same way, we can let the impurities of our lives, our sin, affect our saltiness. We need to say that, and I just want to bring us to the reality of where this salt is. So there's three things. Rock and sea salt, yes. Second of all, the fact that we have all these different kinds of salts. Why do we need to know these things? Because what? We can lose our saltiness. So I want us to move on because we're going to build on this a little bit different direction. We're going to shift to the bottom half of our passage. It says, "You are the light of the world." Right? And the passage reads on, and we're going to sort of shift gears here because there's a lot more description in this passage. And we're going to move to a little bit darker and lighter metaphor. But we need to understand when we look at the word light, the light is used in the very simplest terms as a universal metaphor for truth, wisdom, and guidance. And so when we talk about salt, that's one thing, and distinctiveness. And by the way, there's lots of uses for salt, right? In fact, one book I read listed about 9 different general purposes for salt. Some as medicine, some as flavoring, some as preservative. And those are some of the main ones. It was even used for currency. And what we get is the picture of salt was extremely useful for so many different things. And I don't think it was confined to one specific usage when it's talking in this passage. But the one that's mentioned most is directly is what? Taste. Taste. And our lives as Christians ought to what? Help bring flavor out of life when the world has lost it. Well, anyhow, this light metaphor that's used here, universal metaphor for truth, wisdom, and guidance. The second thing is this phrase, of the world. And this goes back to salt of the earth. That Christ's scope is not just our own little circle where we're comfortable, whether it's Jewish, whether it's Korean, whether it's American. Where will we make an impact? Well, God wants us to make an impact everywhere, throughout the whole world. And we see this also with the gospel and the Great Commission, how we're supposed to bring this to the world. Jesus, in his parable, has two parables, that flow in this passage. One's very short. Our first statement that says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." Now, during Jesus' time, they had lamps. And these were the smallest lights that you could have. These little lamps, you fill them with oil, the big hole in the center, you fill that up, you stick a little wick and you light that other end, and it could burn fat, but usually what they used was olive oil. These lamps could be so small, you could put them on the toes of your shoes. And so when there's that psalm in Psalm 119, it says, what? Your word is a light unto my path, a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path. There were actually shoes with little lamps on them. And you could walk very slowly with little lights to give you guidance. And one of the things that I feel like in our Christian lives, we think of ourselves as, oh, I'm not that strong a Christian. Oh, I don't have that much benefit to give. And we think of our lights as so tiny. But I want us to understand that this metaphor of a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. You know what it's essentially saying? It's too big to hide. When we think of our Christian faith, do we think of our faith as something that's huge? Or, I don't want to say too much. You know what Jesus is saying? Our gospel is humongous. It's not made to be hidden. You can't hide it. How can an elephant hide behind one little twig? You can't. How do you disguise a city so you can't see it? You can't. If it's on the hill, it's open and exposed. During those areas, you wanted those spots because they were strategically important. And so it wasn't about obscurity. It was all about what? Strength and prominence. It says a city on a hill cannot be hidden. It's too big to hide. We have this gospel. It's so large. And one of the things that we need to come to grips with in our Christian faith is having an appetite for faith. This is the kind of belief. This is the kind of faith that we have. This gospel. And it's huge. We shouldn't hide it. The passage goes on, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. And this goes back to this picture of the little lights. And if you go and excavate in ancient Near East and throughout the Mediterranean, you're going to see all sorts of lamps. And based on the type of lamp, the shape it is, the decorations, they can actually use lamps as a form of dating. So if they find a house and they excavate the house and they pull up a lamp, they can look at the design of the lamp and they can date the house on the basis of that. It's fascinating. But lamps are all over the place. Today we take it for granted because at nighttime the lights go down and what we do, flick on the light switch and we can keep on reading, we can keep on studying, we can keep on working. But back then, light was so very precious. And if we wanted to extend the day, we had to use these lamps. But oil was expensive if you keep on burning it. And you could set a little lamp, and even the tiniest little lamp would still give enough light for quite a large area at night. The human eyes are capable of adjusting logarithmically, right, to different levels of light. Fascinating. Much better than cameras. If you know cameras, we tighten down the f-stops, and each level is so much less light. But our eyes do it automatically. And Jesus is telling that even a little lamp, you set it in the right kind of place so it will give light to the whole room. Just to give you some perspective, even something as small as this. When Jesus says, you put this lamp on the stand, what should we realize? When it says, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. The conclusion I believe we should come to is that we were made to shine. We were made to shine. You know, I think Asians really struggle a lot with insecurities and fears and doubts. And Jesus tells us who we are. You might think, oh, I don't have much. I don't feel confident. No, you don't have to worry. You already are light. You already are salt. You have something that's so precious and so valuable. It's not because you're so great. It's because of the gospel. So our passage then goes down and says, in the same way, let your light so shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So to round out this section on light is really two statements. When we do good, it points to God. When we do good, it points to God. You know, some of you may think, oh, but Pastor Eric, I'm not going to go into ministry. I'm not going to be a pastor. That doesn't matter. Anything and everything you do that is good will automatically point to God. Because you're already salt. You're already light. This is who you are. And you know what? Those good works then, if you want to put it in mathematical formula, is or exactly equal to light. Light. Don't be discouraged. Don't stop doing what is right and good and beneficial to other people. Jesus starts us with this identity statement. Because why? Because we finished the Beatitudes. But all of this is why? To point to God. To point to the gospel. So to round us out today, go back to our original title, Appetite for Faith. And our first two questions, are you spiritually hungry? You know, I don't know about you, but I like a little bit of salt in my food. Right? And I think one of the things that we need to understand is that God made us and gives us this identity of being salt. Precious. We can see and understand and know life in a perspective the world cannot. It gives it meaning, hope, purpose. And as far as creating spiritual hunger in other people, likewise. You know, because we have the truth, do you realize that we have the ability to engage people in discussion, to provoke their thought about their lives and why they do what they do, and to begin fitting these pieces together and showing them a picture of what goodness in God's plan can look like. I like this picture because to me it exemplifies very much how light ought to work. We have light streaming from above and light that spreads throughout the world. And it's all centered in the cross, what Christ did for us. And so when we talk about salt and light, one of the things I also want to ask is, how do the Beatitudes fit in with salt and light? You know what? Jesus was simply what? Inviting us. He said, blessed are those who are meek. Blessed are those who what? Are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who are persecuted. And it's always an invitation. It's never forced. When we fail, we can get back up again. And we try and strive for these things to what? Build our saltiness and to keep it pure. To enhance how we shine in the world. If we understand these Beatitudes and make them so deeply ingrained in our lives, people will be drawn to us automatically. People will be able to understand how life works. Is our faith so distinctive and so illuminating that people want what we have? So, number one, our kingdom identity is what? I am the salt of the earth. You know, as a Connect Church, I hope that we understand that we are so distinct and unique. The second identity here is that I am the light of the world through Christ, right? And we have something we can do. I want to give you 5 things that may give you some guidelines on how we can begin going and being light. It's just built off the word shine. Share your faith. Share your faith. It can start off as simple as, what do you do on Sundays? Do you go to church at all? Where are you with God? By the way, this past Sunday, I was with some of my church friends, and we were talking about just so that they know. And you begin building the conversation, understanding towards faith. You probe gently if they're open. But then you begin to share the gospel with them. Oh yeah, that's not what I believe. In our Christian faith, it's really fascinating. Because when I make mistakes, God forgives us and we get to try again. And there's no grudges. Grace. When people fail. Grace when people struggle. Grace because we have a hope. All these reasons. Shine. Own your faith in how we understand Christian faith and how we live it out. This one's hard, isn't it? Because we don't want to study the Bible naturally, do we? A lot of times. And we don't want to change our behaviors and say, let me try and sin less so that I can match up to the standard of Christ who has sinned less. Right? And instill this hunger for the world, in the world, for God. When people are around you, do they want to be around you? I don't like it when I see Christians and they're sourpusses. I can think of some of those candies, right? Super sour candies. And I don't know. Some Christians haven't figured it out. They're so grumpy or so pessimistic about life. I'm like, that's not a tribute. How to follow God and how to love Him. But to be what? Somebody that enhances the joy and the flavor of life. Someone that helps give guidance and hope along the way. And to never diminish the gospel. That is interesting. What we say, what we do, how we present ourselves would never, ever be offensive for the sake of the gospel. Now, we sometimes may need to offend with truth. What I'm saying is that I would never get in the way of the gospel. To offend with truth is a different thing than to offend because of who you are and how you act, and what you say, what you think and do. I find it very fascinating that what we think often telegraphs to other people without even saying a word. Part of my job as a pastor is to read people. And the funny thing is, sometimes you read, and you may not always get it right, but that's our job. We need to listen with our ears as well as our eyes. And we need to begin to see ourselves in that same fashion. And never diminish the gospel. Exalt God always to everyone. That our lives, everything we do, always points towards God. So in that, I have just 2 last sets of questions. Are you ready to get out of the salt shaker? It's like a jailbreak, right? Get out. Spread your saltiness. And another picture. Are you ready to shine? Are you ready to shine? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We know that to be salt and light is not a question because you've already made it our identity. But will we continue in it and grow in it? Lord, you've given us purpose and meaning and all these different things that are blessings. But Father, we struggle. And we think sometimes that we're not good enough or that we're never making any progress. But Lord, you give us this. We are salt and we are light. I pray that you would help us to start living that out and to see what kinds of opportunity that we can be salt in other people's lives, that we can bring light into other people's lives, that in any and every good act, that we would be able to become a blessing, and that we would be a testimony and witness through good works, our words and actions and attitudes, and all that we do for your glory. May we live ready to shine the gospel in every way. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.